Hey there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Peep Into Education. My name is Kylie Elizabeth, also known as the Virtuoso Educator. And on today's episode, I have TeAna Conaway-Manson coming from Maryland. And TeAna is a educator. She calls herself a disruptor, and she's also the CEO and founder of Cultured Connections. And I connected with TeAna and her partner Ashley on Instagram through their wonderful resources and kind of keeps us up to date and some points of views around education that I just really resonated with. So I was really excited to get these ladies on the episode with us today. And so we're going to talk a lot about cultural responsiveness since that's what they focus on. And I'm really excited to have TeAna here with us and kind of share her story. And so, TeAna, I'm going to have you start by introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what led you in your educational journey into the world of education.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Kylie, so much for having me on today. I'm super, super excited to be here and get to have this conversation with you. I think that
Absolutely.
open dialogue is the most important thing that we can do to kind of help any cause that you have. If people aren't talking about it, people aren't talking about it, right?
Right.
So, just a little bit about me. So I am the CEO and founder of Culture Connections, but of course, that all started with my education background. So my education background, I always like to say, started before I was even born because my mother was a teacher as well. So it was definitely kind of just brought into my blood that education was important. And then I was able to watch my mother teach, and I saw the impact that she had on the students. So I'm from a small town in Maryland. Shout out Salter. If you never heard of it, it's about 30 minutes from the city. That's what we tell her. But she taught for so long, and her students would literally come up to me years later and still say, "Hey, are you Miss Ellis's daughter? Oh, she was my favorite teacher. She taught me this." And it was be some obscure fact from fourth
Mm-hmm.
grade where I'm just like, wow, like the impact that a great teacher can have is
Yes.
astronomical. So that was my first real footstep into education. But of course, like most teenagers, I didn't want to follow in her footsteps. So I changed my major about 3 times before we landed on
Mm-hmm.
education. I did end up teaching in Prince George's County in Maryland, and I also taught fourth grade. So you try to avoid it, but it always catches you in the end. So I did teach fourth grade just like my mom, and my experience teaching literally changed my life and in so many different ways. I think that being able to see firsthand what our teachers experience on a day-to-day basis made me appreciate the profession more and really knowing what it feels like to be um, in the trenches, for lack
Yeah.
of a better term, like really being the one with these students every single day, trying to meet all these standards and requirements, but also trying to build these relationships and, keeping in mind the first thing they tell you, they don't care what you know until they know that you care. But I'm also supposed to be grading these papers and giving these tests and doing all the stuff the state is mandating.
Yeah.
So it was
Mm-hmm.
definitely a balancing act in that sense. I did teach through the pandemic. Virtual learning was a roller coaster, to say the least. And then hybrid learning was its own roller coaster in that way as
Mm-hmm.
well. When I did transition out of the classroom, I transitioned into the educational technology space, where it just gave me an opportunity for more flexibility, I think, to work from home. It was definitely like a 180 from being inside of the classroom and having so many demands on you all at the same time. So
Right.
transferring into the ed tech space was really a unique experience as well. And I'm still inside of the ed tech space, but founding Culture Connections was really born out of, now that I was outside of the classroom, I was able to sit back and think like, what do our students really need that they might not be getting on a daily basis? What are those things that some teachers are getting bogged down with so that they're not able to go that extra step and go above and beyond, form those relationships? And for me,
Mm-hmm.
it was that cultural responsibility. I taught in PG County, which is a primarily Black district. And we had our own unique challenges, of course, but I grew up in Wycomico County, where it was a primarily white district, and I was the only student of color in my magnet program, in my gate program, things like that. It
Hmm.
did get a little more diverse when I went to high school, but I didn't even go to the high school I was supposed to go to. I went to a different high school with a little more diversity intentionally done by my mom. So it was definitely an interesting experience. And I feel like that all of that culminated into culture connection and our mission to really bring that cultural responsiveness to schools and districts because we understand the impact that it really has when students
Hmm.
feel connected to their
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And definitely, I tell people on my podcast, I was like, if I'm looking down, I'm writing notes. So, and
right now.
taking
I got
notes,
you.
you definitely share so much things. And I love that, you started with, you being a teacher started before you were born because your mom was a teacher.
Right.
And I think it's interesting because most of us are always like, yeah, I don't want to do what my parents do, but it always
Right.
happens to be that in the field of education, if your parent was an educator, you're more likely, I feel like more 90% to
Yeah.
still go into that route. I
Absolutely.
think overall, as much as the hardships that they are in education is, and teaching specifically, it's very rewarding. It's a great path to be in too. And so I'm thankful for your mom, too, because I love how you said the impact a great teacher can have is astronomical on a student. As we know, it's amazing. It's so beautiful to see when, and even for me as like a teacher, I haven't taught since 2020, but I still have students that reach out to me or tag me like, this was my favorite teacher that did X, Y, and Z.
Yes.
And I just, it's such a great feeling. But then to still have compliments from a parent that may have taught, years or decades ago, that's such a beautiful experience. And I love that. So thank you so much for sharing that part. And then kind of leading into cultured connections and all of the work that you're doing in DEI and equity and advocacy. My question to you is what with your definition and kind of in your pedagogy and practice, what does being culturally responsive mean to you? And what does that look like?
Absolutely. So I think that cultural responsiveness as a general definition is kind of spot on, you know. It's about knowing your student, understanding who they are culturally, and that means, whether it's race, their age, their pronoun, their ethnicity, their culture, where they come from, understanding all of these things about your student and then responding. So it's more than just the acknowledgement of their culture, but it's the assessment of your own behavior towards individuals from that culture, and then the adjustment of your own bias that you might have when you are interacting with students. I think that some teachers, and especially because I do, majority of educators are purely intentioned. So they think that, hey, I'm not, blankist, right? I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not any of those things, so that it should be fine with me just going in and teaching and not having to be intentional about the way that I interact with students of different cultural backgrounds. But the truth of the matter
Yeah.
is that we all have bias, right? We all
Yeah.
have biases. We have individual biases, we have societal biases. All of those things are real, and the existence of them isn't what the problem is. The problem is when we let those biases impact the way that we interact with students, and it's going to happen naturally if we're not intentional about not letting it happen. And I think
Yeah.
that's the part that a lot of teachers need to be reminded of, which is one of our primary services that we offer is that unconscious bias training, because not only do we need to define it and let teachers know that it is real, it exists, it's okay that you have it because we all have it. But then let's truly assess the way that that impacts the way you run your class. One of
Right.
the best things that I ever did, my very first year teaching, my mentor teacher told me to keep a journal. And I kept a
Yeah.
journal and I would write my daily reflections in it. And what it did is it made me realize that there were certain students that I was on them, like on their behind. Like no matter what they did, I was like, this is this today. And I, trying to be, a first year teacher, trying to get my classroom management together. But it made me realize I'm like, okay, so if student A does this and I respond this way, but student B kind of did the same thing today and I didn't respond that way. Why is that? And it could be
Mm,
anything. Like I said, I taught in a county that was primarily Black. So it wasn't always racially based, but it might
sure.
be sex. It might be that I'm harder on the girls in my class because I was a little Black girl. So I expect
Hmm.
more from you, right? So I'm a little bit harder on you when it comes to things like discipline and academics. And maybe I have a preference for boys. So I'm a little nicer to them, a little more lenient, things like that. But things like that affect your student on a deeper level.
Hmm.
They're gonna notice that you only ever ask the girls to clean up in your classroom. Like they're gonna
Yeah.
notice that when student A does this, he gets sent out and written up. But when student B does it, he just has to go to the cool down corner and then he can rejoin the class 5 minutes later. Like
Mm,
things that teachers aren't always consciously aware of because that's why they're unconscious bias, right? Of
yeah.
course, there are teachers who have conscious biases, which is a whole different program. But I think that recognizing implicit bias and things like that is the most important part of cultural responsiveness because you can't respond if you won't acknowledge what it is
Yeah.
that's happening.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
yeah,
It's so important, and I loved how you even like address your own things that you've noticed about yourself. Reflection is a huge piece in education that even when I went through my master's, like they did talk a little bit about it, but it's not very like extensive, at least in a teacher preparation program.
right,
And we may hear it when more we're getting evaluated as a teacher, and across the schools, and hey, like now reflect about how you did, and some
right,
can't see those things. So journaling, I think, is very beautiful. I was told too, like keep a notebook about
yeah,
for everything that happens. But it was interesting because I was told, like, make sure you're writing down about students so you have like a log
mm,
if there's something that
like
happens. But it
documentation.
wasn't, yeah, documentation, but it wasn't like document yourself, right? And document what are
Mhm,
you doing in the
mhm.
classroom. And a lot of us kind of, especially new teachers, kind of go in not knowing what to look for and expect. So I think that was a great note for your mentor to say, reflect on yourself, and what are you noticing. But then also for us to be able to read that and dissect it properly, to notice those things, like, hey, I'm actually treating the girls different than the boys. And I think that was a huge part. I think innately we do that as male and female, is that, we do see ourselves and reflect in ourselves as like a
Right,
woman to the girls, or a man to the boys, because we're trying to really aim at them not
right.
doing or repeating things that maybe we have
Yeah,
done. And I kind of look at it the same, like with my 11-year-old daughter. Like, I'm very hard on her. And even the men in our life are like, you're so hard on her. I'm like, no. I'm like, because this is how it needs to be for them. And you know what I
right.
mean? Like, we're a woman and we
Yeah,
know what that means. And so just to put that in, but for that perspective, as an educator, it's really important to take ownership of our own behavior. And even like you said, it's not always about race. It can be about, the gender. It could be about just general behaviors that even some that might under our skin as a person, like, I don't like
yeah,
this type of behavior. And
absolutely.
so we definitely can. I've been there, and I've I'm just even thinking about this one student that I'm like, oh, I know I was going to see the student today. And and it just brings so many flashbacks. It's been a little while since I've
Right.
been in the classroom, but I definitely get that piece. And I love that. Another thing that you mentioned too, and kind of falls in line of your guys's podcast, or sorry, not your podcast, but your Instagram. So it's called Get Cultured EDU on Instagram.
Mhm.
And again, you guys have some really great content on there. And you also mentioned about professional development and things like that you're working in. And I see that you were just at the NAPE conference talking about unconscious bias training and things like that. So do you all do a lot of trainings, and kind of what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I'm sorry, Ashley is my partner, right? So
Okay.
she honestly, when we met through our traditional 9 to 5, and
Hmm.
I just knew that we had so many common interests, and so she's a
Hmm.
former educator as well. She also went to an HBCU, and she went to North Carolina A&T. Very important that
Nice.
I throw that out there. I went to Bowie
Yes.
State, so we're
Mhm.
and we would just talk. We would have dialogue. We would talk about certain things that were bothering us about the educational landscape, and so many things were in alignment. And so when she became a culture partner, that's when things really started to take off. And I think that people underestimate the value of a good partner, of having somebody who's aligned in your values in any space in life, but especially in business.
Absolutely.
And it really things started really to take off from there. So we were just at Nate, so I wasn't able to attend, but Ashley went and she killed it. Like when I say people are still messaging her on LinkedIn, just like, "Hey, I really enjoyed your session." Like we that is something we pride ourselves on the most is like our master facilitation skills. Like we know how to keep a crowd engaged, how to get them thinking, how to make them actively participate in the learning. And that's because
Mhm.
we're teachers still. Like at your
Right.
core, you're still a teacher. So the same way, there are adult learning principles and theories and things are different when you're talking to adults because they need a little bit more of the why and things like that. But there are some basic things about engaging an audience that as a former teacher, it's the same thing. Nobody
Right.
wants to sit and listen to you talk for 2 hours.
Right.
Like,
Right.
my students did not wanna sit and listen to me for a 90-minute reading block, and your teachers don't wanna sit and listen to me for a 90-minute PD either,
Right.
right? So when we take those rules of engagement that we had in the classroom and are able to fuse them into our professional development, that's why the sessions are so good. And
Nice.
she, like I said, she absolutely rocked NAEP. We did do the 4Gs, so it was a framework for culturally responsive pedagogy. So one of the things that we try to make sure that we always talk about is how cultural responsiveness has to become a part of your pedagogy. So it has to be something that you embed into the way that you teach, into
Yeah.
your identity as a teacher, because it's not something that can be a one and done. You're not going to do
Right.
a get to know me activity in the beginning of the year, see what your students say, and then be able to take that one piece of paper and just be a culturally responsive educator for the rest of the year. Like, that's not how it works. It's
Right.
something that has to be embedded into your daily routine, into the way that you do everything, into how you decide how you're going to call on students. Are you going to do equity stick so that you don't end up calling on the same students all the time? Because your natural bias will make you do that, right? And
Yeah.
of course, we as teachers, we want to talk to the students who are going to talk to us, right? So you start to call on the students who are going to help move your lesson along a little bit more, right? And I
Mhm.
think I like to use my own example because it makes teachers feel less intimidated and
Right.
not like, hey, I was a perfect teacher and I'm trying to teach you how to be a perfect teacher, but more so, hey, I was a teacher and I know how it gets real in there,
Mhm.
and so let's try to navigate some of the common situations together. So the framework that
Absolutely.
culture came up with for culturally responsive pedagogy involves those. It definitely involves the acknowledgement of your unconscious bias and then the different ways that you can mitigate its impact inside of your class. But yeah, professional development and
Mhm.
conferences, that's like our main thing right now. I think that it has that reach potential. So many different leaders and educators come to conferences, so it's a really good
Mhm.
place to reach them. And then,
Yeah.
um, you know, one of the things that we miss the most is the student, right?
Yeah.
You miss being around kids in general. Like nothing really could lift my spirits the same way as like I could be having a terrible morning, but I
Mhm.
know that at 7:15 when them kids walk in, like, oh, Miss Manson, like they are so happy to see you. And like just so genuinely happy to see you that it's like, dang, I can't even
Yeah.
really have a bad day anymore because y'all are
Right.
so excited to be here.
Yeah.
But I think what allows us to continue in the space that we're in is knowing the impact that we're having. So I
Absolutely.
had a classroom average of probably 27 kids ish. So, we rounded up to 30. We'll say, so instead of 30 students, you get 30 teachers in a room for PD, and each of those teachers has 30. And now
Right.
maybe instead of 30 teachers, you get 30 principals. And each of those principals has 150 teachers at their school. And all of those teachers each have 30 kids. So it's like the reach and the impact
Yeah.
is so substantial that we're still doing what we were always doing. It's just at a higher level. So
Absolutely. And that's great. And I love that. And the fact of too, yes, the reach and like who's gonna hear it and who's gonna soak it in,
yeah,
right? And who's gonna take it back to the classroom. And that's one thing that I've mentioned a lot. And I like that one of your posts talks about, having useful PD and that it's liked and it's
yes,
and it's actually heard. And there's nothing worse than time wasted over the same PDs over and over again that are so very, very redundant. And it's something I spoke
oh
on
my
to
goodness,
the other day is like, we have such redundancies and PDs that it's like, it's just not effective. And so having,
right,
these types of professional development for those one who actually really want it, because there is a big difference of, and I like when they're at conferences because people are choosing to therefore come to
right,
your
exactly,
presentation, and
yes,
and it's so much better because that they're gonna like actually want to hear it and listen to it versus this kind of be integrated into and I'll ask that question in a minute, like being integrated into the classroom and or not the classroom but into the school basically as like a
right,
mandatory training, and we
mandate,
know that
yeah,
could be that could be received maybe a little less in a friendly way from certain teachers,
absolutely,
and so I think again, yeah, it's so important. And I love what you shared too about the reach. And I do some professional development myself with a lot of teachers, and I'm really excited because this year at one of our summer conferences I'm finally presenting a session called storytelling, and it's basically about my experience as a multicultural educator in relation to building relationships, right? Because I come from, I
yeah,
say, both sides of the fence, right, as being both black and a white woman, and just seeing the experiences, but also experiencing things differently through my life because of the races that I am, and to that context, but and then how I've built relationships around using cultural diversity and equity and inclusion skills and things like that. So I think it's really beautiful
absolutely,
when people want to hear this type of information, but
yeah,
more importantly, they take action with it. And that's the other side of the platform is like, okay, you have the info, now what are you doing with it?
yeah,
And
right,
that's where I'm interested to see, and I love that people are very receptive and giving you positive feedback on that. So that's
absolutely.
awesome. Um, have you been in a space where maybe the training wasn't received, like they didn't want it, or have you been put in that position where it was kind of mandated, and what was that experience around that?
Yeah, so I definitely think that, as you said, there's a difference between conferences and then like school mandated PD, right? There's always going
Mhm.
to be that little edge of a groan of like, okay, so I could be grading papers, talking to parents, doing one of the million other things I have to do, but instead I'm sitting in the cafeteria listening to this person who
Mhm.
doesn't know nothing about the stuff that I'm going through, right?
Yeah.
So I think even in a situation where, so we've definitely done PD where it's mandated by, the principal or whoever the school leader is. And you go in and you can kind of already tell there's a little bit of a vibe
Yeah.
about the whole thing. I think
Yeah.
one of the things that we pride ourselves on doing is the connection. So the same way that we encourage teachers to connect with their students, that's why we make such a big deal about the fact that we were educators, because I'm like, I understand exactly what's happening. If it's early in the school year, or let's say it's before school, I'm like, I know you would rather be in your class right now.
Mhm.
I know that that's what you'd rather be doing right now, but I'm like
Yeah.
asking you to be here with me, like be present with me. I truly feel like I have something valuable for you that'll even help you in what you're about to go do. So, the different
Yeah.
examples and tangible takeaways that we give are going to be different, even depending on the school that we're at, what time of year it is, things like that. So if it's back to
Mhm.
school, maybe we're focusing more on the cultural responsiveness of how you decorate your class and the kind of posters you put up and the textbooks that you're choosing to use and things like that. So I think one of the things that we do is that we make sure we make that connection first. Like, hey,
Absolutely.
we know what it's like to be in the seats that you're in. So, and we've sat through boring PD, right?
Mhm.
We've all sat through PD where I'm like, wow, that was the worst 90 minutes of my life. Like, I don't
Yeah.
even understand why my principal would think that that would be beneficial to me, right? Or this doesn't have anything to do with it. So I think after the connection, one of the most important pieces is making sure that everybody feels like they're going to learn something valuable, right? And
Right.
so again, that education piece. we're educators. I know that at the beginning of a lesson, you ask people, well, what are you hoping to learn from this
Mhm.
session? What do you think that you'll be able to gain? If you don't think that you can gain anything, what do you think about the topic as a whole? Because sometimes people's unwillingness is just from their lack of knowledge, right? When you hear something like, oh, we're going to an unconscious bias training, there's a lot of feelings that come up for
Mhm.
people around something like that before they even get there. But
Mhm.
acknowledging those feelings goes a really long way. Saying like, "Hey, I know some of you guys are uncomfortable already. Like we haven't even begun, but I know that you're uncomfortable with what's about to happen right now."
Yeah.
Is super important. You know, we have a acknowledgement at the beginning of all of our trainings where we talk about how we're trying to create a safe space and that we'd rather you ask your questions with us right now than just
Right.
continue to not know. And we've
Right.
been asking wild questions, like questions that I'm just like, oh, well, thank you for asking that question. Like, need a little bit of time to like gather
Think about
yourself
that.
and like make
Yeah.
a real response, right? But it's so amazing to see teachers become comfortable enough with you to ask the hard questions. And I think we've even been asked questions that the intention was to be controversial or snarky or, discredit the information that we're giving out. But because this is our passion, because this is what we do, because we are experts, it's not difficult to take that energy and reverse it. Same thing with education. You're always going to have those students who just are not engaged in your lesson, who are refusing to soak up the information that you're trying to give out. And I think it depends on what you're doing. So if we're, in a school and we have 150 teachers in the auditorium, I'm not putting all of my energy into the 10 teachers who seem disengaged, right?
Right.
Because there are
Yeah.
140 other teachers who really want to know how to do better and be better and become culturally responsive and start to embed it into their daily routine. So I think, like I said, it's just so funny how much PD and facilitation mirrors the classroom. And
Yes.
teachers are the worst students. I say this all the time, and I've always said it. They're the worst students. Oh, it's you're having a PD, but you're secretly checking your email on your laptop. That thing we tell
Yeah.
students not to do. Don't try
Not
to
to do.
multitask because you can't.
Yeah.
Oh, you're talking to your neighbor while the presenter is talking, like things like that. It's just always so funny to me. Teachers, the behavior, it's just always literally all the things we tell our students not to do, like all of it. Did you
Absolutely.
not go to the bathroom before the PD started? Like, what are we doing here, guys? Like, literally. But I think
Yeah.
it just gives us so much to remind ourselves that, hey, we've been here, we understand the struggles that you guys are going through, and we're here to help. And I think
Right.
that's the thing too. Of course, we have our presentations and things like that. But we stay very flexible in the direction that the presentations go because every school and their needs are different,
Right.
right? There are going to be some schools where acknowledging the unconscious bias is going to be the hard part. Where even getting people to say, yes, I understand that I have unconscious bias is going to be the most difficult part. And then there are some schools where that part doesn't seem hard, but acknowledging that your unconscious bias has a negative impact might be
Mhm.
the hard part. Or some
Yeah.
people don't want to do the work of the tangible takeaways of, hey, so we talked about it, it's negative, but you don't want to do the extra step in order to
Right.
mitigate that bias might be the hard part. So I think staying flexible is also one of the biggest things that we have to do. So no matter what crowd we're met with, we're here to fulfill your needs. So whatever you
Right.
guys need, like that's what we're here to do. And
That's,
again, same thing, right? You have a
yeah.
lesson plan planned out, but if it goes the other way, hey, this is what we're learning today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny because I was like just in a PD. Was I? Now I'm trying to think. Was I in it or I wasn't facilitating, but I was in a
So,
room and it's like a whole bunch of
yeah,
adults. Like, or I'm like, are you guys like? The teacher in me is like, wait, are you guys not going to be quiet and listen to like what is
right.
happening? And and
Exactly.
it's definitely and you could definitely see like where people are unengaged, and I think that's a good point too. Is like certain depending on who's in the room and like again the level of engagement and if they really want to be there or not. And again, it does mirror the classroom very much so. And I think as adults, we're less inclined to listen to our own peers, especially in the education world, because I think, we're all kind of mastering our own skill and our own craft. And some can be very egotistical or very like protective over their craft. And they're like, I don't, especially seasoned teachers, like, I don't want someone coming in here and telling me how
Yeah.
to X, Y, and Z. And I totally get it. But I think what's really important, like you said, is to be flexible, because in education, our world shifts all the time. The culture, the environment of the school can shift. That we went through a whole pandemic, like life changes like very quickly. And
Right.
the same for our students, things change very rapidly in their lives. And having the approach of being more caring and more like, hey, we're actually here to support you. And it's not an authoritative or authoritarian style type of, you need to know this, so you have to do this type of thing. I think
Right.
that's what's really important with professional development, especially with adults and teachers, is like, okay, this is what we have to give you, because obviously we've lived the world. This is our experiences now, and we want you to understand. But also, do you understand yourself enough to understand how you are impacting these kids? And
Right.
in my session, I talk a lot about my experiences as with my male white teacher that I have experiences, with other teachers, and just what, like, people do not realize sometimes how much, like, these, even the smallest phrase or sentence can be with you your entire life. And I think that's
Absolutely.
really
Yes.
important, to acknowledge those like inner thoughts that we have. And we may have negative thoughts and feelings about our peers or our students, but we shouldn't be saying certain things, right? Because that negative impact is actually a lot stronger, even over all the positive things that we do, because you could say the one wrong thing to that person, and it really impacts them their entire life. So I love how, yeah, you share that piece. On the other side too, you talk about being in that ed tech space. So what does that look like for being part of the education technology, and what do you
Yeah.
do in that sense?
Yeah. So I think that being a part of the edtech space was definitely something that just made sense after, when the pandemic began and things like that. And we did have to transition into a more technology advanced world as teachers. So I think that it was already kind of coming, but the pandemic made it go into hyperdrive. Like, hey, you don't really have a choice anymore. Like, you have to learn how to use Google Live. You have to be on Zoom, whatever your school was using Google Meet, whatever they like. You have to do, like, you have to transition. And I remember being a younger teacher, I was kind of tossed into the PD role before I had any interest. I didn't want to get up in front of these teachers who've been teaching for literally longer than I had been alive and try to tell them how to do anything. But, one by one, they would kind of come to me like, hey, I have to set up my Google class. I'm like, hey, I have this. Can you help me do it? And so
Mhm.
eventually, admin caught wind. So then I just started doing little sessions about, hey, so this is how you set up the classroom. Here are some of the more frequently asked questions. And it was just natural.
Yeah.
It felt very natural to be teaching at that point. And so when I transitioned to the ed tech world, it was as a professional development associate, essentially. So,
Nice.
I would go in and the company that I worked for, the product, I would train teachers. Hey, this is how you use it in the classroom. Here's the most effective way to embed it into your daily routine, things like that. And teachers love the product. They just didn't know how to use it as effectively as they could. So it was still the same thing. It was taking
Mhm.
something, being able to show teachers, hey, this is how you use this, and then getting that feedback like, wow, this was so engaging. Like, this was an amazing PD. I'm so glad I came. I didn't feel like this was a waste of time. Like, little things like that, you start getting the feedback where you're like, oh, okay, like I might be pretty good at this. And that's how me and Ashley met. So we met through our 9 to 5, also um, doing professional development. So we were essentially doing the same job. And, we would even like watch each other's recordings. And I was like, oh yeah, like she gets it. Like she knows how to keep people on their toes. She knows how to keep people engaged. And I think that Ashley and I have different styles, but they're both still very effective. Like I'm definitely on the like calmer side, but
Yeah.
that's one of the things that teachers say they enjoy about my PD is that it seems very like I'm not anxious, so they're not anxious, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not like, "Oh, we gotta get through this, like, we gotta, busting through
Yeah.
these slides," so they're just like, "Oh, like, this is so calm, I feel
Just kind of
very
laid
safe
back.
here," like, taken
Yeah.
care of, and then, like, Ashley, she's very high energy, and, like, she is a people person, like, that we've talked about that, and I'm like, "That is your superpower," like, she will connect with people feel like they know her
Yeah.
after they talk to her, like, after they have her sessions and things like that, and she's just so personable. But teachers love that too because it's just
Yeah.
like students. They wanna feel connected to the person teaching them something, and then they're so much more open to learning from
Yes.
you, right? Because they
Yes.
like you, because they feel valued in that space, because they feel like you like them, you know?
Right.
So, like I said, there are plenty of adult learning theories that we had to embed into our presentations and things like that at the 9 to 5. But ultimately, a lot of our teacher skills are what transferred over to being such effective facilitators. And
Right.
that is what transferred over into culture. So using the EdTech space was kind of like, and we're both still a part of it, but we kind of use it as that space where we learn and hone our skills. Like we're getting the feedback, and if teachers are saying like, hey, I really enjoyed this about the session, didn't enjoy this about the session. I feel like this part could be better. So even though we were teachers, we're now getting this sense of this is what teachers are thinking now about
Right.
the professional development that they're having. So we're
Right.
able to kind of take that and use it to improve our own PD and the things that we're giving teachers as well. But being in the ed tech space is really great. I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon, just in
Yeah.
general, if
Yeah.
anything, there's just going to be more technology
Yes.
embedded in the
Absolutely.
classroom, use more computers, things like that. And I do have like mixed feelings about it, I guess,
Hmm.
like growing up in that very interesting space where we saw technology just boom. Like,
Hmm.
I was still using floppy disks when I was in 4th grade.
Hmm.
Like, that's how I turned in my presentations. Like, you put a
Hmm.
PowerPoint on a floppy disk and don't let nothing happen to the floppy disk because if it gets
Right.
scratched or something, that's it. Like, you're done,
Yeah.
and it could only
Yeah.
hold one thing. So you had to
Yeah.
label it because you weren't about to put everything on it. Like,
Right.
to go from that to, I'm having virtual school and
Yeah.
having students turn in assignments on editable PDFs and things like that, like, it's a big jump.
Yeah.
So I feel like
In
we
real
were really
time.
in a unique position to see that
Hmm.
happen, like you said, in real time. But, um, I think there's always gonna be something to be said for the old school method. It's nothing like pen and paper, nothing like having students even practice their handwriting, things like that.
Yes.
So I definitely think
Yes.
there are downsides to technology. I think there are some things that are just lost on the new generation, generation
Yes.
alpha, I think is in school now,
Yeah.
and, things like handwriting, like, it's not great because they don't
No.
write as much as we used to,
Yep.
like, we
They
had to
don't.
handwrite things, so
Yeah.
it got better eventually,
Yeah.
even telling time on analog clock. I don't know if
Hmm.
it's a particularly useful skill anymore because everything is digital, but, like, literally, it was funny because my students my first year would always be like, "Oh, it's time to, like, do this," because they'd be, like, looking at the clock, "Oh, recess is in 10 minutes," or something like that. So I just switched it to an analog clock, and then they didn't even
Mm.
know what time it was. So
Yep.
that was it. Like, I was able to solve that problem because I'm like, "Y'all can't even tell time on this clock,"
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
crazy at the same time,
Hmm.
though, because I'm like, "Y'all really can't tell time on this clock?" Like,
Yeah.
what?
Absolutely.
So I definitely think that.
Yeah, and I thank you for sharing all that. And definitely I agree. I talked so much on it and people are probably like stop talking about this, but I because I watch my own children, and their use of technology, and even as I taught through the years, and like you said, reflecting on when we were younger and what was available. And yes, we were fortunate to have a lot of robust pen to paper, just like old school, actually physical books in our hands. And I think that does so much better on our just, I guess, natural ability to learn in a with pen to paper and physical items in our hands versus constantly being on something digital or technology or
Right.
a tablet, a computer. because that, looking at this blue screen all day long, as we know, with research, it's not good on the brain, but yet this is what we're heavily reliant on in education. And it is a little bit scary for our kids, but yes, they don't. I was just in a field trip with my daughter's fourth and fifth grade classmates, and they can't even use a calculator, like an old school calculator, and they
Just
were
like
on a
calculator.
regular calculator. And even when I put one up like on my phone for them to use, like they don't know how to use a calculator. And I'm just like, wait, why don't we know how to use I'm confused. Like, you don't know, well, how to press the, okay. And I'm
Right.
like, that's a concern. And then the other thing I noticed a lot
Right.
too is that they, in this field trip, they were doing a scenario, but they were given like an older computer, a desktop computer, and it was not touch screen. But you notice like every 5 seconds, the kids were trying to like touch the
They're like
screen. Like they're
tapping
just
it. That's so
yeah.
funny.
They're like, oh, trying to enter, like pressing it like they're on a tablet or something. I'm just like, oh gosh, these kids don't even know how to use a mouse. Like it's just, but it's like, it's not wrong because it's not,
Yeah.
it's not with their times. And so I try to be very like understanding, and even, going back to the context of working and training with teachers and educators, like so many of us are used to certain Excel over Google, or, the different types of platforms that are available. And
Right.
I think for us too, it can become overwhelming because there's so much things that are available to us where we have so many choices. Then it's like,
Yeah.
okay, which ones are we going to use? Especially if you're working with a district that's like, I only want you to use this
Right.
specific
Yeah.
platform, versus I'm like, I don't want this one, like my 9 to 5 makes us use Teams. I hate Teams. I'd rather use Google. Like, so
Yes.
I
Oh my
definitely
God.
get it. It's an interesting sense in working in online, and it was the same for me as like even podcasting. It's like, I don't want a podcast, like everybody's doing it, you know what I mean? But then it's like, we kind of like, this is the times that we're in, and this is how people are soaking up like information. So
Right.
it's like, it's not jumping on the bandwagon, but it's like, okay, just take advantage of what technology is currently available and use it
Right.
appropriately. And that's what I advocate too when we're talking technology and education. And even when I ran our micro school, it was like, okay, let's not heavily rely on the technology to do the learning, the teaching for our students and learning, like use it as a supplement, right? Like we still do the pen to paper, as much old school techniques as we can without the computers in their face, and then supplement with the computers so then they can do, on target learning for where they're at in their academic skills. So there's so many things. And again, we could do the sense of that with educators as well, because we all have our own learning styles, and, we all don't learn the same way. Which is important to address as well. So thank you for sharing on that. And so one other thing I want to mention too is, again, we kind of always talk on this platform is about, concerns and things that we see in education. And of course, right now, DEI, as we notice in the news, is like under attack, I guess, to say in lack of better sense of terms. But you guys also shared, which was a very popular conversation about the student, who couldn't go to school because of his hairstyle. And then we see, DEI be taking out a federal level because of funding and all of these things. So as somebody who focuses in this area, what is a concern that you have around these types of issues that we see in the news in relation to education? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that you bring up a really good point. There are so many organizations, public and private, stripping DEI programs of their funding, like literally laying off entire staff and things like that. And it's unfortunate because there was a big boom in DEI. But I think that because you kind of recognize what was happening, right? So it's the same thing with technology now. Like there are always going to be buzzwords in education, in the media, among organizations. There are always going to be these things that are like, right now, this is an important thing. Like, we have to make it look like our organization is aligned with DEI because that's what people are looking for.
Right.
But I think one of the things that you have to be able to do is that you have to be able to discern when organizations are genuinely trying to positively impact the individuals and the culture of their organization and when they're trying to check off a box. And you can
Right.
tell by the
Right.
conversations that they have, the questions that they ask, the depth that they want you to go into when it comes to certain things, And, this old school saying, all money ain't good money. Like there have been people that have asked to work with us that were just like, oh, that's not really what we do. Like we're not a checkbox. Like
Right.
it's not going to give what you need it to. Like your employees are gonna be mad when they come out because they're gonna be like, that is not what y'all told us our DEI training was gonna be.
Right.
And even in the 9 to 5 corporate world, you observe how, oh man, what is the word? How I can't even think of what the word is, but it's like it's not demonstrative, but it's the word when people are just doing something to look like they're doing
Oh
something.
yeah, I heard. I can't think of
When
the word either, but
when
I hear
you're
what you're saying.
just yeah, like I don't know why I can't think of the word right now, but
Yeah.
it's so obvious to us. Like when you go and you talk to a leader and they're telling you, "Oh, we just want this. We don't need that. We don't need that. We don't need like the equity assessment. We don't need you to come in and like actually look at the numbers and we don't want to talk about like what percentage of our promotions are a certain race or a certain gender or a certain." And I'm just like, okay, so you're not looking for like change. You're looking for to check it off the list to say that you did
That
some
you did.
DEI training,
Hmm.
right? To say that
Hmm.
like, yeah, we care about DEI because look, we paid these people to come in and talk to you guys about this, but that's not what we're about. Like, I'm not here to placate you to make it cute or friendly or easy to digest, and that's why like that disruptor title is important because we're gonna ask the questions, like the questions
Right.
that people don't ask, the things that you don't say, the things that are not polite that you're taught very distinctly to not do in like a professional setting because hey, you don't want to make people uncomfortable, but that is what it takes. I have
Right.
found that throughout all of the advocacy that I've done in my life, nothing changes until people start to get uncomfortable. It is very uncomfortable for people to sit in traffic because people are protesting. That's why things happen because they don't want to be holding the traffic. So,
Hmm.
okay, something needs to be done. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
when I went to Bowie State, we marched for Mike Brown and sat in an intersection as long as his body was left on the street and things like that. Like there are things that have to happen in order to spark change. And I think
Yeah.
one of the things that I try to really embody is that you have to say the quiet part. That's something
Yes.
that we say. Like, hey, we all know what's happening here. We're just gonna talk about it plainly.
Hmm. Yes.
This you are being treated different. Why do you
Hmm.
think you're being treated different? Race? Sex? Because of your sexual orientation? Because of your neurodiversity? Like, what is it? And
Hmm.
people know. That's the thing. It's like when we
Yeah.
have the conversations, it's not earth shattering
Right.
information, but
Exactly.
having the conversation is what's earth shattering.
Hmm.
Saying to a person in charge, hey, I feel like you're treating me differently because I'm Black. And then just sitting there, that is something that when we do our
Yeah.
individual coaching, we talk about so much because we're like, that silence
Hmm.
is where the change comes in. You don't have to fill it in. We made a post about it recently. Like, don't laugh when something inappropriate happens. And as people of color, as women, it's like a natural defense, right?
Yeah.
Like somebody says something super out of bounds, so inappropriate to you, and you kind of giggle, right? Like, huh, you don't want to create the tension. You don't want to be the one that's difficult to work with. You don't want to be the one that can't take a joke. But no,
Yeah.
and we teach people there are questions to ask. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And then you wait for them to answer. And it's so interesting as like a social dynamic what happens after you are brave enough to ask that question. What do you mean by that? And then
Hmm.
you just wait and you see what they say because a lot of the time
Yeah.
that's when like the stuttering starts and the
Yep.
uncomfortability and oh
Like
I didn't mean
like
that
yeah.
and I meant this
Hmm.
and it's like but that's not what you said,
Right.
and I think that as Black women in a corporate space we had to learn that for ourselves. Like that
Hmm.
was a journey we were literally taking. So that's why we were able to do now the individual coaching of people in those spaces, because it's like, no, I'm not saying this as somebody who's never done it. I'm saying this as somebody who literally had to sit in front of her white female boss and say, I feel like I'm being treated differently. I don't
Mm-hmm.
feel like you manage my other teammates the same way that you manage, and
Yeah.
had to sit there in this uncomfortable. When I say I was like, I had to get pumped up to have this
Yeah.
conversation. Like
Yeah.
literally on the phone with Ashley, like, oh my God, I'm about to say it. Like I'm about to ask her. Like we have our one-on-one. I'm going to say it today. Like
Mm-hmm.
literally listening to my like, you got this playlist on Spotify. Like had to get pumped to say, hey, this
Yeah.
is how you're making me feel. But what I encourage people to always think is how uncomfortable they've made you feel, they can feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
They don't have a
100%.
problem making you feel uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, by the
Yeah.
things that they say and do and stuff like that. And to, kind of transition into what you were saying about, like the young boy who couldn't go to school because of his hair and stuff like that. Like, obviously, I have lots too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was so funny because, of course, when I started them, the first thing my mom says, "Oh, what are you gonna do for like interviews? Like, what are you gonna like wear a wig? Are you gonna like go out? Like, what are we gonna do for the professional side of it?" And I'm just like, Mom, I don't want to work anywhere that I can't. I
Right.
don't, and
Exactly.
that's the difference, though, and it is a luxury, and I
Mm-hmm.
realize and recognize that now I have the luxury to say, "Hey, I
Yeah.
don't have to work anywhere where I'm not allowed to show up as myself
Right.
authentically, where I'm not allowed
Right.
to be who I am." Everybody didn't always have that luxury. If
Mm-hmm.
people felt more comfortable when you straightened your hair, that's just what you did because you needed a
Right.
job. There weren't a lot of options back then. And I always
Yeah.
thank my mother because I'm like, you guys made all those sacrifices for us. You got us in the door. And
Mm-hmm.
so now we're not doing that no more. We're not
Right.
tiptoeing around. We're not scared. We're not, oh, I can't say this. We're okay. So what's really going on? Why is it
Yeah.
that
Why?
the black people at this company aren't being promoted? Why is it that the
Mm-hmm.
women at this company aren't being promoted? Like, what's going on? Like, asking the
Yeah.
tough questions, saying the quiet part out loud. Everybody knows. It's
Yeah.
just a matter
Everybody.
of, are we going to talk about it, or
Yep.
are no,
I
we're
think
not.
that right. Oh, and I think too, people isn't it's an interesting line between being non-confrontational versus standing up for yourself. And people, I feel, think you can't stand up for yourself to avoid being non-confrontational or confrontational with people. And I'm at a point in my life, like, listen here, like, you're not about to treat. And I'm talking any
Yeah,
relationship, my kids, my partner, my
absolutely.
boss. At the end of the day, we're all human beings and we deserve, like you said, to be our authentic self and be who we are. As long as we're not harming people, we're not over here talking crap about, there is no reason to be treated differently, just based
Yeah,
off of our hair or color of our skin or our gender, like all of those things. And to me, it's like that why question, right? Is like, why are you treating me this way? And
yeah,
what am I doing so bad to you that is making you treat me this way? And yes, those uncomfortable conversations, because I've definitely been in that space where it's like I was blatantly told, no, I can't write you a letter of recommendation after I did something for this team for 3 years. And I'm looking at them like, why? Like,
yeah,
why not? And it was very clear that, as a person of color, like, they just didn't want me to move into the next level of my
yeah,
career. Like, you wanted to keep me trapped in this. And I've also been in this space. I won't say what brand it was, but I worked for a very popular clothing company, and I worked there for 3 years as the stock supervisor. And one day I went in natural, right? I used to straighten my hair all the time when I was younger, and I went in natural, and I caught, of course, a high boss was in there, and they had the nerve to say I wasn't in dress proper attire and dress code and all this. And I said, what?
see,
Excuse me?
that's understandable.
Oh, if we're gonna write me up, we're gonna have a problem because now you're
Right,
being racist, and this is
right.
a whole thing. And this was back in 2011, like before we even had
Oh my
any of these
goodness.
acts
Yeah,
going in. And so
yeah,
even as a person that's biracial, like, I've kind of dealt with these things in different capacities, and even for my peers, not being accepted as a person of color, or being questioned, what am I? And so, like, people, we get it from every direction. And
Absolutely.
definitely in the workplace, it's not a space to be in where we clearly live in a society that's very diverse and has so many different groups of people. And to me is like, why do we not embrace that? And then
Right.
asking the question, what are you afraid of? And I won't get into that today, but I think we all know is like, what are they afraid of? If
Right.
we have DEI initiatives, if people are truly and genuinely being treated equally, with equity, and being included, and not having, these fears of speaking up for themselves because
Mhm.
they don't want to get in trouble, or they don't want to lose their
Absolutely.
job, or all of these things. And it's not a place, especially in the world of education. And I'll kind of leave it here, is we have no space for this in education,
Yeah. There's
because
just
we
no space.
have so many blended families, so many people from different backgrounds, so many cultures reflected in our schools. Like, we cannot be educators if we're not willing to, I think, address our own conscious, unconscious biases, as as you reflect and teach on. And it is not a place for us to be secluding people or treating people differently because of what they look like, or all of those other areas that they are. So I thank you so much, TeAna, for sharing all the things that you shared with us today. And is there any last thing would you like to get off your chest, or words of wisdom to our listeners?
I could go all day. I could go all day. But
We
I
surely
think
could.
that the last thing that I'll really say is that when it comes to culture connection, one of the most important things that we talk about, and it's kind of like our motto, our vision, is that we talk about breaking barriers, building bridges, and shattering silos. And that's really what we're about. We don't want people sitting in these bubbles of silence, whether it's schools, whether it's private organizations. We want people to feel comfortable speaking out, being transparent. Like I said, when people are really being treated fairly and with equity, there is a lot of pushback on transparency. We want
Hmm.
to encourage people, especially educators, that it's okay not to be a perfect educator. Nobody's expecting perfection from you. We just want to help, and that's really
Absolutely.
what we're all about. We just want things to improve. The state of things right now is not where we want to rest, right?
Yeah.
It's where
No.
we want to continue to resist. So
Yeah.
that's what I
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much. So where can the viewers follow you all for Culture
Yes,
Connection? What platforms?
absolutely. So we are on TikTok, Instagram, at Get Cultured EDU on Twitter or X as well. You can go to getculturedconnections.com for more information and in depth about the services that we provide and things like that. We also did shoot a season of Cultured Conversations on YouTube as our own
Nice.
podcast. Taking a little break right now, but definitely go check out those episodes where we talk about DEI and CRP in depth. We have some really dope guests as well on the podcast, so definitely check it out. But yes,
Awesome.
at Get Cultured EDU on all the platforms, wherever you are, we are.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So I'll be sure to tag all of those in the comments and the description. But thank you again, TeAna, and everybody watching. Please be sure to like, follow, and share myself, Kylie Elizabeth, the virtuoso educator, and TeAna and her partner Ashley on Get Cultured EDU. And thank you all. You all have a great day.